everyone. I'm Nancy Netzer, inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History in the Department of Art, Art History, and Film at Boston College. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this evening's publication highlight. Before I introduce our lecturer this evening, I want to thank Rachel Chamberlain, the McMullen Museum's Manager of Education, Outreach, and Digital Resources, for organizing our online series of talks by authors of recently published books. And if you would like to receive notification of future programs, please go to the McMullen Museum website to join our email list. Now, this evening, I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing Oliver Wunsch, a distinguished colleague and celebrated scholar of 18th and 19th century art of Europe and the Americas. Professor Wunsch came to Boston College in 2019 after recently receiving his PhD from the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. His training, also as a painter and printmaker, has informed his research and teaching on the history of artistic techniques. His articles have appeared Art Bulletin, the Burlington Magazine, Journal 18, H. France Salon, and Early Modern French Studies. And his research has been supported by fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington, the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome. He's currently working on a book about the materials and techniques European artists developed in the 18th and 19th century to represent skin color. The book is provisionally titled Skin Pigments, the Materiality of Art and the Origins of Race. He will speak to us this evening about his book, published in January by the Pennsylvania State University Press, entitled A Delicate Matter, Art, Fragility, and Consumption in 18th Century France. Professor Wunsch will talk for about 40 minutes, and then he will take questions. If you have a question while Professor Wunsch is speaking, you can write it in the Q&A. And now I ask you to join me in congratulating Professor Wunsch as I invite him to take over the screen.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Rachel Chamberlain, for doing all of the behind-the-scenes work of organizing this event. And thanks, everyone, for being here to hear a little bit about my book. Let me bring up my slides. I hope you can see them all now. Excellent. So in my talk today, I want to share with you how I came to the topic of my book and to give you a sense of its main arguments. Then, in the second half of the talk, I'll focus on a single artwork from the book, showing you how my claims apply to a remarkable piece of terracotta sculpture. And I'll conclude with some brief comments about the contemporary relevance of the book. But let's start with the project's origins. This book began with a question that occurred to me when walking around the Louvre in Paris during my early years in graduate school. What preoccupied me was whether it was possible to draw a clear distinction between the fragility of art and the flimsiness of consumer goods. If you've been to the Louvre, you know that it sits on top of an enormous subterranean mall. In the floors above ground, you have centuries of priceless art. Below ground, you have everything from McDonald's to the Apple Store. It might seem perverse to draw a comparison between the fragile works of art in the museum and the cheap commodities in the basement shops. For example, I think most of us would agree that a world of difference separates the delicate brushstrokes of Jean-Honoré Fragonard's paintings from the latest season of trinkets and fragrances on display downstairs in the Fragonard perfume shop, even if the store is named in the artist's honor. A painting by Fragonard, such as The Warrior's Dream of Love, may, like perfume, suggest evanescent pleasure, but the museum makes sure that we regard the painting as much more than an expression of commercial ephemerality. Signs on the museum's walls tell us that, quote, works of art are unique and fragile. They have traversed centuries and must be preserved for future generations. The museum here presents art's fragility as something that has no connection to the whims of the marketplace. On the contrary, the fragility of art here stands for the opposite of fashion, representing something whose value transcends time. But my research made me skeptical of this clear-cut distinction between the delicacy of art and the ephemerality of consumer goods. I had been studying the history of artist materials and techniques in the 18th century, and I was struck by the unprecedented proliferation of physically unstable art from the period. Some artists made objects that were fragile by design, creating pastel portraits whose friable surfaces were vulnerable to the slightest touch, or constructing spectacularly breakable sculptures from attenuated pieces of clay. For other artists, impermanence was an unintended byproduct of a search for novel and spontaneous effects. They mixed experimental additives into their paint that soon caused their work to crack, darken, and flake. In fact, the Fragonard painting that I showed you a moment ago belongs to this category. Before the painting's restoration in 1987, it was considered unworthy of exhibition because it was in such poor condition. The painting's decay stemmed from the process of its production. Fragonard employed an unusual quantity of a drying agent when painting it, which soon caused broad cracks to form across its surface. The use of these drying oils was a notorious problem among painters at the time, so much so that the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture had issued warnings about it in the decades before Fragonard produced the picture. These ingredients allowed artists to work more quickly and to produce atmospheric effects, but they resulted in damage within a matter of years, rendering paintings nearly unrecognizable. My book began to take shape as I tried to understand the relationship between these materially unstable works of 18th century art and the economic system that underpinned them. The 18th century was a pivotal moment in the history of the art market. Private collections grew in both number and size. Art increasingly changed hands at auction, and art dealers acquired a new professional status. The shop sign that Antoine Watteau painted for his dealer's storefront provides a glimpse of the commercial spaces that increasingly structured the consumption of art. Buyers browse for new acquisitions on the right. Workers on the left are busy loading a portrait of Louis XIV into a crate, perhaps symbolically acknowledging that that royal patronage no longer dominated the artistic economy as it once had. The growth of the private art market was significant because it subjected art to competing temporal pressures. On the one hand, the commodification of art led to a new concern for issues of conservation. Collectors prized art's materiality as the bearer of an artist's autographic touch and as a source of sensory pleasure, which meant that art's value became intertwined with its physical condition. On the other hand, the market created short-term incentives that were at odds with the expectation of durability. Artists had to work quickly to make a living and to keep up with trends and taste, which could lead them to take technical shortcuts. In addition, the demand for sensuous surfaces and novel techniques among collectors pushed artists to become more experimental, sometimes causing them to sacrifice permanence in the process. The painter Jean-Baptiste Udry warned about this tendency in a 1752 lecture to the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, explaining that artists had been led astray in their search for beguiling surface effects. Quote, "The seduction that it achieves passes like a dream, and all this beautiful work turns yellow in no time at all." To an extent, the 18th century art market simply intensified a tension that had existed within artistic technique for centuries. Artists throughout history have balanced their desire for posterity's recognition against their impulse to take technical risks. Leonardo, to cite one notable precedent, continually tested unusual combinations of materials that compromised the integrity of his work. But the art market that emerged in the 18th century did more than amplify the degree of such experimentation. What makes the technical transformations of the period distinctive is their connection to a deeper shift in temporal expectations associated with fashion. As Francis Haskell has shown, the collecting culture of the 18th century led to a new awareness of how quickly tastes could change as dealers and connoisseurs observed how talented artists often fell out of favor and slipped into oblivion. This change in consciousness helps explain why artists at the time began to reconsider whether it was worth trying to please posterity at all. The sculptor Etienne Maurice Falconet famously proclaimed that he worked only for viewers in his own time. Francois Boucher made comparable statements on multiple occasions. One of his friends observed, quote, "We often heard him say that he only worked for his century, and that he was convinced that his works, so praised, so sought after by his contemporaries, would not receive the approval of posterity." Such declarations did not always translate into technical practices. Neither Boucher nor Falconet were especially negligent in their workmanship. Their statements nonetheless point to a significant shift in the horizon of expectation from which artists regarded their future reception. The vicissitudes of commerce revealed the provisional nature of any cultural canon, highlighting the perils of aspiring to join its immortal ranks. And in a commercial sphere that could offer lucrative rewards in the present moment, the necessity of making physically permanent works could no longer be assumed. The connection that my book draws between material impermanence and market forces is not a topic that has received much scholarly attention among art historians. One reason for the lack of research on the subject, I think, is that art historians generally see damage and decay as little more than impediments to research. Because we usually study the relation between art and the period in which it is made, we tend to assume that the original appearance of an object is the only one that should matter to us. As a result, we leave questions of material instability to conservators and scientists, entrusting them to halt the effects of time as best they can. When we do encounter signs of damage and temporal change in our objects of study, we typically regard these alterations as a distraction, not as a subject that demands interpretation. This is not to say that art historians have been entirely indifferent to issues of temporality in 18th century art. In fact, much of the scholarship on the period addresses exactly these concerns, but treats them as a question of form, not materiality. Anyone who has a passing familiarity with 18th century French art knows that delicacy plays an important role in the style of the period. Rococo art revolves around sinuous lines and asymmetrical shapes that appear to teeter on the brink of collapse. Foundational studies of the style trace its origins to the realm of court spectacle under Louis XIV, tracking its evolution from the playful palace decor of 17th century artisans such as Jean Bérin to its apotheosis in the work of 18th century painters such as Watteau, Boucher, and Fragonard. What requires further attention is the connection between the stylistic manifestations of transience and its physical presence in art's very substance. Grasping this link is crucial not only to appreciating the technical features of 18th century French art, but to understanding how the period fundamentally altered the relationship between art, time, and value. At the heart of this transformation, I argue throughout my book, is the concept of delicacy itself. Delicacy had constituted an important social norm in the court of Louis XIV, where it described ineffable refinement in behavior and in conversation. 17th century dictionaries typically emphasized these social aspects of the word, defining delicacy as a fine and subtle mode of conduct, as we see here in this example of a dictionary definition. But at the very end of the 17th century, an additional meaning becomes prominent in definitions of the term. For the first time, French dictionaries use the word fragile as a synonym for delicate, and they use delicate to describe breakable luxury products, such as glass and porcelain. This materialized conception of delicacy took its meaning from the commercial sphere, where physically delicate consumer goods, from lace to ceramics, functioned as emblems for the social delicacy of their owners, particularly the ascendant class of merchants and financiers who sought entry into the world of courtly sociability. For artists, the commercial fetishization of delicacy offered both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity was a license for material experimentation, a chance to explore unstable materials and the dazzling effects that they could yield. The problem, however, was the potential charge that art had become nothing more than an ephemeral commodity, a fashion that the newly affluent used to advance their social position. In this context, art's physical delicacy became subject to competing interpretations. From one perspective, its fragility was essential to its ineffable attraction. From another vantage point, its perishability was simply evidence for the tyranny of commercial ephemerality. How could art maintain its exalted status when it was increasingly governed by the same physical and temporal forces that shaped the production and reception of other commodities? This was the dilemma that the physical instability of art made visible to 18th century artists, critics, and collectors. It was also a problem that artists addressed through their materials and techniques. One way to respond was to reject fragility altogether, to promote materials and techniques with claims of indestructibility. And my book goes into some of these efforts, such as a quixotic attempt to revive the ancient technique of encaustic painting. But the other strategy, the one that would ultimately have a more lasting impact, was to present art's delicacy as something distinct from that of other commercial products. Doing so meant investing material delicacy with new meaning, attaching it not to the fleetingness of fashion or the ephemeral patter of courtly conversation, but to the indefinable essence of creative inspiration. It meant reclaiming the elusive aura that had surrounded courtly delicacy for a different domain, ascribing its transcendent and ethereal powers to the specific class of delicate objects that we call art. My book then ultimately shows how the materiality of 18th century French painting and sculpture transformed delicacy from a commodified extension of courtly sociability to a defining feature of art's irreducible essence. I track this transformation across a series of case studies that move chronologically through the 18th century, each focusing on a different material or technique, from cracking oil paintings to powdery pastels and breakable ceramic sculptures. It's the last of these categories, ceramic sculpture, that I want to explore with you in more detail, focusing on a single object. The sculpture you see here is the work of the artist Claude Michel, better known by his nickname Clodion. Throughout the 1770s and 1780s, Clodion helped establish a booming market for terracotta sculpture. He did so in part by playing with the medium's fragility, precariously extending his forms to give them a sense of weightless movement. The sculpture on your screen is no exception. Created around 1784, it commemorates the invention of the hot air balloon in France the previous year. Louis XVI briefly contemplated commissioning a monument to honor the French conquest of the skies, and Clodion supplied this nearly 4-foot-tall model for consideration. But the proposal was hardly a serious bid for royal approval. Clodion had a difficult relationship with the Royal Arts Administration, having long neglected state-sponsored projects in favor of more lucrative work for private clients. His proposal for the balloon monument was not much of a conciliatory gesture toward the crown. The torrents of cherubs and swirling smoke were a far cry from the austere classicism that the state had adopted for public projects in recent years. The sculpture's unstable and dynamic forms would also have been difficult to translate into marble had Clodion actually been awarded the official commission. Clodion's balloon monument, then, was likely not so much a serious proposal, but a promotional stunt that allowed him to do what he did best: produce a dazzlingly precarious object in the fragile medium of terracotta. Clodion's work, in its fragile and lighthearted engagement with the tradition of sculptural commemoration, 18th century. On the one hand, the era revived the classical rhetoric of heroic eternalization, giving rise to the modern pantheon, the cult of great men, and the triumphant erection of statues meant to immortalize the era's intellectual achievements. On the other hand, these initiatives emerged against the backdrop of a private market with a more playful sensibility and shorter temporal expectations. In contrast to the state sponsorship of sober marble monuments that projected an image of permanence, a rising class of newly affluent merchants and financiers gravitated to small-scale, delicate ceramics. Clodion's balloon monument therefore offers a case study for understanding these tensions and their competing temporalities. Moreover, Clodion allows us to see how artists adapted their fragile creations to a political climate that had grown increasingly hostile to overt signs of Rococo decadence and ephemeral consumption. Clodion worked at a moment when critics and government officials had become all too aware of the links between market forces and physically unstable goods. Yet Clodion, as we will see, managed to succeed in protecting his breakable terracottas from the worst of these critical attacks by linking the precariousness of his sculptures to the instability of artistic genius itself. By reframing the debased flimsiness of the disposable commodity as the transcendent delicacy of artistic creation, Clodion gave commercial ephemerality a venerable guise. The result was a union of artistry and commercial spectacle that would endure for generations to come. To understand how Clodion transformed fragile consumer goods into transcendently delicate art, it helps to know something about his materials and techniques. Terracotta was an ancient medium, consisting simply of clay that has been baked or dried in the sun. Its name, derived from Italian, provides an even more succinct definition: cooked earth. Sculptors throughout the early modern period had used terracotta both for finished sculptures, which were frequently glazed, and for unpainted preparatory models. The difference between a study and a finished work could sometimes be unclear. such as when Bernini produced unglazed sketches that collectors prized as autonomous productions. By the middle of the 18th century, collectors had come to embrace terracottas as independent works, which were understood to provide an unmediated trace of the artist's hand. The medium, however, had its downsides. Most notably, it was significantly more fragile than bronze or stone. The problems could begin even before the clay entered the kiln. Overly wet clay can form cracks as the material dries unevenly, like a lake bed parched in the sun. Impurities in the clay can also cause cracks during firing. And after firing, even the most carefully constructed terracotta objects remain vulnerable to clumsy handling and accidental collisions. Auction records for Clodion's work going back to the 18th century often note damage to objects or explain that they have been repaired. Collectors sometimes called on Clodion himself to reattach a severed limb or two. In the second half of the 18th century, the fragility of terracotta represented more than a practical nuisance. At a time when anti-Rococo critics assailed what they viewed as the tyranny of fashion and ephemeral consumption in the arts, fragility posed a political problem. Defenders of terracotta, however, devised several responses to these attacks. The antiquarian and amateur, the Comte de Caylus, for example, suggested that the fragility of terracotta, in fact, made it an ideal tool for reforming French taste, precisely because the medium's delicacy would appeal to hedonistic consumers, helping to wean them off of even more distasteful porcelain knickknacks and other disposable commodities. Quote, "We could gradually accustom them to terracotta. Its fragility would become a merit in their opinion." Other commentators went further in excusing the medium's physical delicacy, comparing the fragility of terracotta to the volatility of inspiration itself. The dealer and connoisseur, Pierre-Jean Mariette, expressed this perspective, comparing the fragility of terracotta to, quote, "that creative spirit, that sparkling and entirely divine fire that emanates from the soul, and that an instant of reflection is so ready to extinguish and make disappear." The fire of inspiration soon became central to the redemption of terracotta as something more than a fragile luxury good. The amateur Lalivre de Julie, for example, observed that terracottas were superior to other forms of sculpture because, quote, "one better finds in them the fire and true talent of the artist." Fire evoked the heat of the ceramics kiln, but it also linked terracotta to a Promethean rhetoric of masculine creation, distancing the medium from the supposedly effeminate realm of fashion and consumption. The rhetoric of fiery originality surrounding terracotta, however, belied the realities of its use among 18th century artists such as Clodion, who relied on a team of assistants to churn out copies of his works using molds. And here you see an example of two statuettes that were likely created from the same molds. We can infer some aspects of the production process within Clodion's studio from a posthumous inventory of his possessions, which describes numerous molds along with entire lots of limbs and torsos. Clodion and his assistants assembled such body parts into complete sculptures, creating new works from molded pieces of previous ones. Before firing, Clodion would add a few agitated gestures to the surface of the object using a sculptor's tool, creating the impression of a unique work conceived of in a fit of inspiration. And here you see details of the two previous works showing the areas where they subtly differ. This sense of the artist's ineffable imprint helped enhance a sculpture's value. Autographic works commanded a significantly higher price than copies, but it also served to protect the object from the perception that it was a disposable commodity. The key point was for the delicacy of the object to evoke the ethereal soul of the artist without conjuring the insubstantiality of a consumer society entranced by ephemeral luxuries. With this balancing act in mind, we can turn our attention back to Clodion's balloon monument. The subject itself was inextricable from market interests. The rapid development of ballooning in France in the 1780s was a commercial achievement as much as it was a scientific one. Balloons proved to be lucrative opportunities for inventors who sold tickets to massive crowds who watched in awe as the enormous contraptions rose into the sky. Balloons also proved profitable for a whole range of ancillary industries. The Montgolfier brothers, whose balloon launches in the early 1780s inaugurated the balloon craze, were in fact paper manufacturers who recognized in ballooning an opportunity to promote their business. Collaborating with the wallpaper designer Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, they turned their balloons into lavishly decorated objects that implicitly served as advertisements for their paper products. As public fascination with ballooning swelled, so too did opportunities for artists and merchants to profit from it. Balloons soon appeared across the decorative arts, adorning snuff boxes, fabrics, tea sets, and fans. Louis XVI was eager to celebrate the balloon as testimony to French grandeur, but he also needed to be cautious about the technology's association with fashion and commerce. At a time when the crown was defending itself against charges of frivolous expenditure, it was essential for any state support of ballooning to be perceived as a patriotic endeavor. Royal descriptions of the invention therefore downplayed the entrepreneurial aspects of ballooning, while presenting balloonists as selfless citizens devoted to the glory of the nation. A royal monument would, in theory, provide an opportunity to reinforce this message, tethering the balloon to the weighty concepts of posterity and immortal glory. Clodion was not among the sculptors officially invited to submit a proposal for the monument when the Royal Arts Administration announced a contest to determine its design. In fact, he was not even a full member of the Royal Academy, having never bothered to submit his reception piece. His entry into the competition therefore likely came as something of a surprise, but it is not hard to imagine Clodion's reason for submitting a proposal. The contest was an opportunity to draw public attention to his work, and the subject was ideally suited to his techniques. The fiery ignition of a hot air balloon resonated perfectly with the rhetoric of combustible inspiration that surrounded Clodion's chosen medium. This connection between Clodion's subject and his materials helps explain why he devoted most of his model not to the balloon itself, but to the process of fueling it. At the base of the monument, Pudi are hard at work gathering bundles of hay to heap on the fire that fills the balloon with hot air. The many winged infants, approximately 30 appear in all, were likely created through Clodion's habitual use of molds, although none appear exactly identical to any other. They swirl around the cylindrical column, carrying the hay through clouds of smoke to feed the raging fire. The top of the model provided Clodion a chance to push the fragility of terracotta to its limits. The balloon itself appears nearly weightless, an effect amplified by the floating personifications of wind and renown, whose bodies extend precariously into the open air. The delicate model, like a balloon launch itself, constituted an anti-gravitational feat of engineering, one that appears as if it could break apart at any moment. The unsupported limbs of the figures would have been structurally unsound in marble had the Royal Arts Administration called Clodion's bluff and awarded him the commission. But Clodion had no reason to fear winning the competition, which the Crown soon abandoned. The Royal Arts Administration did not supply a reason for canceling the project, but a likely possibility is that the association of balloons with commercial excess had become too powerful to overcome. A sensational ballooning failure in the summer of 1784 played a decisive role in shifting public opinion. Two aspiring balloonists, the printmaker Jean-François Janinet and an amateur physicist known as the Abbé Miollin, promised to launch an enormous hot air balloon in the Luxembourg Gardens that July. Janinet and Miollin had widely publicized the event and generated significant revenue from sale of advance tickets. On the day of the planned launch, thousands of spectators watched as Janinet and Miollin struggled to inflate their balloon. The crowds, after standing for 6 hours in the summer heat, grew furious and began tearing the flaccid carcass of the balloon to pieces as Janinet and Miollin fled the scene. Satirists seized upon the event, portraying ballooning as an art of charlatans who trafficked, quite literally, in hot air. The public image of ballooning as a seductive and ephemeral fashion likely led the Arts Administration to decide that the subject no longer lent itself to immortalization in sculpture. Perhaps they concluded that even the most sober and solid monument could not redeem an invention that was becoming increasingly synonymous with the hollowness and insubstantiality of the commercial sphere. Clodion's terracotta model stands as the only proposal known to survive from the competition. The sculpture passed through various private collections throughout the 19th century before entering the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1944. There is some irony to the object's survival. In both its turbulent form and delicate materiality, Clodion's balloon monument represented the antithesis of the classical solidity that had historically signaled a commitment to posterity. Ironic as this outcome may be, it also contains a lesson about the legacy of 18th century art. Austere statues of Enlightenment great men still stare down at us from pedestals, but already by the end of the old regime, such monuments had lost their monopoly on posterity. Clodion embraced an alternative paradigm that would ultimately have a more vital afterlife. Rather than resist the temporally unstable norms of the marketplace, he wedded them to the ostensibly purified virtues of artistic spontaneity and imagination. The seemingly artificial unpredictability of fashionable commerce was, in Clodion's hands, transmuted into the volatile trace of the artist's soul. The difference between the debased instability of the marketplace and the lofty delicacy of transcendent art was, of course, not always easy to determine. Clodion's art was no less a product of the marketplace than the spectacular balloon launches that attracted crowds to the Luxembourg Gardens. The major difference was Clodion's knack for presenting the temporality of 18th century consumer culture through the lens of artistic creation. Clodion's balloon monument is just one demonstration of the way 18th century French artists played with the boundary between commercial flimsiness and artistic delicacy. You'll find many more examples throughout my book. But in the time that we have left today, I briefly want to move beyond the 18th century and gesture toward some of the contemporary implications of my argument. Art historians have long recognized echoes of the Rococo in contemporary art, observing that artists from Jeff Koons to Yinka Shonobare borrow forms and motifs from the 18th century. For me, though, the contemporary resonances of 18th century French art are not confined to style. Instead, the deeper legacy has to do with the structural relationship between the marketplace and the temporality of art. Ephemerality can be monetized. That lesson, which was so central to the artists throughout my book, continues to reverberate into the 21st century, especially in the realms of performance and installation art. In fact, my book concludes with the work of the contemporary artist Tino Segal, who takes the commodification of transience to an extreme. He works solely in ephemeral configurations of body and voice to produce what he describes as constructed situations. Museums and collectors then purchase the rights to restage his works for prices upwards of $50,000. No material object, however, changes hands, not even a piece of paper describing the nature of the performance. Chagall strictly prohibits any documentation of his work. The unauthorized photograph that you see here from the 2010 exhibition of Chagall's work at the Guggenheim technically violates his rules. For Chagall, the absence of any permanent documentation is part of the point. It ensures that his work only exists insofar as it is experienced live. Chagall proudly proclaims that if his work falls out of fashion and is no longer performed, it will cease to survive. Chagall's dematerialized art might appear to have little in common with the sensuous materiality of an 18th century painting or sculpture. What unites them, however, is the capacity to turn perishability itself into a source of attraction. Chagall's refusal to produce any stable record of his work becomes a paradoxical source of its allure, creating an aura of rarity and exclusivity around the experiences that he constructs. The very possibility of the work's disappearance serves as a major reason why audiences flock to see it and collectors pay to restage it. Artificial scarcity and planned obsolescence support the demand for many products in contemporary consumer culture. But in Chagall's work, they are elevated to aesthetic principles. Chagall's ephemeral performances represent, then, the latest response to a problem that artists had begun to address 3 centuries ago, as they adapted their techniques to the temporality of the marketplace. Chagall and his 18th century predecessors belong to a shared history of artists attempting to process the temporal effects of capitalism. The implications of this history go beyond the realm of art. In recent years, everyone from business consultants to environmental activists have questioned the capacity of capitalism to encourage long-term projects that benefit future generations. The tyranny of short-termism, as management theorists describe it, has become all the more apparent in an age of climate crisis, when quarterly earnings statements and fast fashion thwart any collective effort to confront an existential threat to the habitable world. In the face of looming catastrophe, art history might appear to offer little more than an irrelevant diversion. Yet, for the artists and audiences in my book, art became a heuristic for working through a question that remains urgently relevant in our time. To what degree can markets support values that transcend the interests of the immediate moment? The fragile paintings and sculptures of 18th century France offer multiple answers to that question. Their prioritization of immediate pleasure over physical durability provides plenty of reason for worry today. Yet their survival in the hands of dedicated caretakers who recognize the importance of preserving them provides, I think, some cause for hope. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, for a most exciting and eloquent presentation. I think none of us will look at an unstable work of art or a fragile work of art the same way again. And what a wonderful contribution you've made in your book. And for those of you who haven't seen the book, here it is. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And while we're waiting for questions, I have one to sort of start us off. Do you have any sense of whether the pastels or collodion sculptures, terracotta sculptures, or bisque porcelain for that matter, were restored in the 18th century? And if so, do we know anything about how the restorers or the conservators approached them?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question because the field of art restoration was undergoing tremendous change during this period. It's really the moment when art restoration starts to become something like a profession rather than something that artists would simply do when asked, hey, can you fix this for me? Now, the professional restoration practices that emerged in the 18th century, they were primarily focused on oil painting, particularly issues around varnishing, whether or not to remove varnish, also transferring works from decaying panels to canvas. Restoring a pastel is extremely difficult. And in fact, even today, in conservation labs where pastels are treated, there's a real reluctance to intervene too strongly, simply because the possibility of doing more damage in the act of handling it is so strong. One issue that can be remedied today is the susceptibility of pastel to mold, because it's very hydrophilic, and so you need to make sure that it doesn't get infected by mold. That we have developed good treatments for today. That was not something that was practiced to any great degree in the 18th century. And the main efforts that were devoted to pastel involved trying to figure out if there were reliable fixatives that could be applied to the surface of the work that would essentially not restore things that had already been damaged, but preserve the work in its current state against future damage. The results were very mixed, and there were some notorious examples of artists and entrepreneurs doing tremendous harm to pastels when applying the fixative. Even just the basic act of figuring out how you apply the fixative was a challenge, because you can't just brush it onto a pastel, because if you brush it on, you're going to remove all of the particles of pastel from the surface. And they didn't have, spray bottle atomizers back then. So they had all sorts of other tricks that involved putting the glue on a stiff bristled brush and then trying to generate a kind of spatter and to do it evenly. You can imagine all the ways that might go wrong. With terracotta, generally the fixes involved adding in replacement appendages, if some part gets broken off. And then there are also issues around everyday maintenance, because a lot of these very intricate forms on these fragile objects, they collect dust. Dust is actually a real threat to these works, not so much because of the dust itself, but because in the act of cleaning off the dust, it's very easy to actually break the object. So those are the sorts of things that come up in the sources from the period.
It's wonderful. Do we know anything about bisque porcelain? Because it's somewhere between terracotta and porcelain, and it's not as, but it looks more fragile.
Yeah, and bisque porcelain, it's as you say, it's somewhere between terracotta and some of the porcelain objects that I showed. And its status is a little unclear in terms of whether it should at the time be thought of as art versus a kind of decorative object. That distinction between fine art and the decorative arts was not fully formed at this time. It was artists were beginning to construct that division. And in fact, part of what I argue throughout the book is that artists feel the need to create that clear division because they see that their fragile productions are being treated as if they were like any other fragile luxury good. And so terracotta is kind of the ceramic that manages to achieve escape velocity, that manages to leave its associations with the commercial culture of other ceramics behind. Bisque porcelain is caught somewhere in the middle in terms of its status and reputation.
Yeah. We have some questions now in the Q&A. The first one is from Diana Larson, who says, I have never seen a sculpture of a balloon, and this one is exceptional. Are there many repairs to this piece? And do you know of any other sculptors who rendered balloons?
Yeah. So, well, we know for sure that there were other sculptors who did render balloons for this contest. We just don't know what their work looked like. There's one other submission that I believe there's some documentation, a photograph of the submission that survived into the 19th century. But yeah, it's a very unusual subject in sculpture generally, and I'll have to think about that. Other examples apart from this competition, none immediately come to mind. In terms of the condition of the Met balloon monument, it's really remarkably well preserved. It's unusual in the lack of significant damage that it's undergone. I talk in the book about some other cases of Clodion's work where I'll identify segments of it that look like they're well preserved, but they turn out to have been modern reconstructions where conservators have to decide: do they leave a missing hand as a broken off stub of an arm, or do they fill it in? And I show some of the cases where they went ahead and filled it in, giving a false sense of its integrity. To my knowledge, the Met balloon monument is actually fairly well preserved in its original state, which is, again, a testament to, well, partly to Clodion's ingenuity in managing to produce these very fine forms that haven't broken off over the years, but also it's, I'd say, testament to the collectors who actually took the care to make sure that it survived to us today.
There's another question here from John Petrowski. He says, the lecture was wonderful. It made me think of so many things about the passing nature of art in relation to it becoming more and more commonly available to a new class of consumers. One trivial question: do you think there is a chance that the depositing of the portrait of Louis XIV into a crate was not because the portrait was not being relegated or even cast aside, but because it had been purchased and was on its way to a deluxe residence? He has passed away only several years earlier. The monarchy was apparently secure despite monumental national debt, and it would have been a sign of prestige to have a portrait of the celebrated monarch. The lecture was brilliant, and I loved every single beautiful phrase.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, John. John's an old family friend, and I can't see your smiling face, but I'm smiling back to you, John. And thank you for the great question. I think you're absolutely right about the ambiguity of Watteau's decision to show the portrait of Louis XIV being loaded into that crate. I should pause to say that the ambiguity goes even further than that, because it's a painting, so it's a static image. We're assuming that the portrait's being loaded into the crate, but nothing rules out the opposite possibility, that it's being taken out of the crate. Maybe it's been delivered here on consignment for future sale. But I think your larger point is right. So Louis XIV has recently died, and the straightforward reading of the painting is that the portrait has probably sold and is being packed up, and Watteau is documenting that there is a market for these old images of Louis XIV, and perhaps also suggesting something of a kind of entombment of the recently deceased king. But for me, there's an additional layer of meaning here in the sense that Louis XIV was a major, major artistic patron. I mean, in the late 17th century, the whole artistic economy revolved around royal patronage. And then well, even shortly before Louis XIV's death, the nation is riddled with debt. The state expenditures on the arts are way scaled back. And in their place, this group of ascendant merchants and financiers steps up, and they start filling the void, and they start to dominate the artistic economy with a whole different set of collecting practices. So, I mean, I think you can read that gesture of loading the king into the crate in a few different ways. It's memorializing him, showing that there's a market for portraits of him after his death. But I think also a suggestion that his reign over the arts has also come to an end as well.
There's another question here from Aurelia Campbell. Could you tell us a little bit more about the markets for works of art made from different materials like pastels versus oil paintings versus terracotta sculpture? How were the objects bought, sold, and enjoyed? Were they commissioned?
Yeah, so there were a range of means of purchasing these works. I mean, some pastel portraits were commissioned. Often with portraiture, that's how it works. The sitter approaches the artist and commissions the work in advance. Speaking generally, there is a shift during the 18th century to more and more works being made on speculation. So the artist wouldn't necessarily have a patron who's commissioned it in advance. And dealers like Watteau's dealer, Gersaint, whose shop sign we saw, dealers would sell these works that artists had created without a particular buyer in mind. And that's part of this transition away from the system of royal and religious patronage, where you have the patron determine the nature of the project in advance, to instead artists having to kind of test the waters and see, okay, what's going to sell, what's going to appeal to people. So there are a range of different ways in which people came to buy these works, but the tendency is a movement away from that sense of security that comes from the advanced planning of royal and religious patronage, and instead a shift towards greater and greater degrees of speculation and testing what the market is looking for.
We have another question here from Emine Fetvaci. Thank you for this excellent and beautiful presentation. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the non-royal patronage, or perhaps buyers of these objects. And secondly, would you elaborate on the relationship between the fine or plastic arts and performing arts in the 18th century? Are they viewed as allied or related? I'm wondering this because of the ephemerality of the objects you told us about.
Yeah, both are really excellent questions. Thank you, Emine. So the first question, a little bit more about the buyers. So one thing that I found really interesting in my research into any given medium was trying to get a sense of the social composition of who was attracted to a medium. Like, take pastel, for instance, which before the 18th century had really only been used as a preparatory medium. And then by the 18th century, it becomes a medium for doing fully fledged independent works of portraiture, in spite of the fact that it had no guarantee of surviving long into the future. And so I was interested in, who are the buyers who are willing to take a risk on this unproven medium? And the truth is, you can find some buyers from a range of backgrounds, including the old nobility, including the newly affluent. But in aggregate, the market for pastel is much more skewed towards these newly affluent merchants and financiers than towards the old nobility, who kind of follow along and get convinced later on, okay, maybe we'll explore this. And to me, that shows a couple of things. I mean, it shows, for one thing, the need of this newly affluent segment of society to show how advanced their tastes were, to get kind of out in front of trends. And then two, there's a kind of risk-taking mentality built into people who are making their money on speculative bets of all sorts of kinds. So some of the thinking that goes into financial speculation can also go into a tolerance for risk in your art buying habits. Now, your second question, I'm now trying to remind myself.
Are they viewed as this has to do with the relationship between the fine or plastic arts and
yes. Oh, and theater. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So totally. I mean, in some ways, the idea of spending lavishly on something that doesn't last, you can go all the way back to, pageants and festivals and theatrical performances way back in history. What becomes an issue in the 18th century is the fact that paintings and sculptures now seem to be part of this world of ephemeral consumption and ephemeral creation. And so there are absolutely people in the 18th century, critics who are comparing now paintings and sculptures to temporary stage decoration and saying, like, look how bad it's gotten in the arts, that people are making paintings that have no greater life than a stage decoration. And that's the problem that artists have to figure out how to respond to, because you have to remember that artists since the Renaissance had been working really hard to assert their privileged position, to say our status as painters and sculptors is way above the status of other people who make things. We're not bricklayers. We're not shoemakers. We're not textile dyers. We're artists, and artists had made great strides in asserting that privileged position. But then the emergence of the commercial sphere, where suddenly works of art are being bought and sold in ways that seem to be very close to the way other commercial products are being bought and sold, that creates a kind of crisis, and artists have to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? Do we reject fragility altogether, or do we say our fragility is a different kind of fragility? It's a better kind. And that it's that second path that I think is ultimately the more interesting and vital one in terms of its after effects.
Another question here from an anonymous attendee. This person says, I'm a little confused. Do we think that the work like The Kiss is a critique of consumerism and art as commodity, as opposed to thinking of art as a repository of the history of a culture, civilization that is unattractive?
Yeah. So in the case of The Kiss and Tino Sehgal's work altogether, I think it's tempting to think, okay, he's he's pushing against the commodification of art by doing something that doesn't last. And that's something that performance artists back in the 1960s had experimented with. But Segal actually says, no, 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 that's not what my work is about at all. He says quite explicitly, I'm pro-market. That's his own, those are his own words. He's all about figuring out how do you monetize something that's ephemeral? How do you make money off of the creation of an experience that has no stable thing you can hold, that slips out of your hand immediately, that disappears from your vision as soon as the event is over. And he has said basically that he sees the attitude of those artists from the 1960s as naive, because in the end, all of those performance works were commodified in different ways. There were certificates of authenticity issued for certain people to be allowed to stage the performance, and those things acquired a market value. So Segal very much embraces the idea that the most ephemeral thing can be turned into a saleable, not object even, but a saleable experience.
And then our last question here is from Aaron Wunsch,
Ah,
to whom the book is dedicated, I think.
it is, in fact.
Can you relate what's happening in terracotta in late 18th century France to what Wedgwood and friends are doing in England around the same time?
Yeah, yeah. The Wedgwood comparison is an interesting one, in part because Wedgwood is less conscious of asserting the distinction between the commercial product and the artistic product. That Wedgwood's work, because it's part of an explicitly reproducible system of production. It's not trying to create that that sense that the fragility of these objects is somehow better than the fragility of other consumer goods. It's more, I think, on that continuum we were talking about earlier when we were discussing different forms of porcelain that seemed closer or further from the luxury market. So I would say Clodion absolutely bears some resemblance to Wedgwood, but Clodion is ultimately, I think, much more sophisticated about obscuring the roots of his work in systems of replication and mass production and commercial marketing. So yeah, I see the comparison, but Clodion is the one who's taking those fragile objects and saying, no, this is a different kind of fragility.
Well, I think we should let you go home and have your dinner. You've really sung for your supper tonight. And thank you so much. It's been an enlightening evening, and we wish you all the best in the distribution of your book.
Well, thanks so much to you, Nancy, for hosting. Thanks so much, Rachel, for organizing all of this, and thanks everyone who attended. It was a treat to hear some of your questions.
Thanks, Oliver.
Good night.
Thank you, Oliver.